Thank you so much for being here. Our panel has shifted from when it was first announced, and that's great because we now have on stage 3 of the most talented and successful agents in the industry. I want to introduce them to you. My name is Priscilla Painton. I'm the editor-in-chief of Simon & Schuster. Binky Urbahn has represented best-selling authors, including at least 2 highlighting this conference, Walter Isaacson and Doris Kearns Goodwin, as well as some of the biggest fiction writers of our time, including Cormac McCarthy, Jennifer Egan, Anthony Doerr, and Toni Morrison. Matthew Snyder is an agent based in LA who sells books to movies, thank goodness, and to television. His big successes include The Social Network, The Big Short, Killings of the Flower Moon, and his TV hits include Rizzoli and Isles, if I said that correctly, and Lovecraft Country. And one of my favorites, Feud, about Truman versus the Swans. Keith is the co-founder of Javelin, a literary agency based in DC that has represented New York Times bestselling authors like Maggie Haberman and Tim Alberta, and American leaders as varied as Neil Gorsuch, John Bolton, Adam Schiff, and let's not forget Orleans natives Mitch Landrieu and Donna Brazil. So I'm going to start by asking a very simple question to all of my colleagues here. Can each of you tell of a book you represented or saw and read that came out of nowhere to become a bestseller? And if so, what did you learn from the experience? Binky.
Me?
Yes.
Probably when it was about 2014, and a writer unknown to me named Anthony Doerr, walked into my office because his agent had died, had a heart attack that summer and died. He had been working for 4 years on a novel, and he was close to finishing it, and he did not know what to do. And he had written up to that point 3 collections, which had maybe in total sold about 20,000 copies. So I was sympathetic because he was distraught that his agent had died. He said, "Would you look at it when I'm finished?" I said, "Of course. Nice to meet you. Goodbye." 6 months later, he emails me and he said, "Do you remember me? My novel's finished. Are you still willing to read it?" And I'm like, "Sure, send it in." And he sent it in, and I read it over the weekend. It was All the Light You Cannot See, which has gone on to sell millions of copies around the world and been the basis for a television series. What I learned from that is when you've got the goods, you've got the goods. And his career started then. And, it's the long haul. You got to look at the long haul. And you've got to stick with authors through those initial years when they're writing books that aren't selling or aren't big books, with the belief that one day they're really going to deliver, as he did.
Keith, do you have a story like that?
Sure. It actually dates to around the same time. This book sold magnitudes of order less than Binky's. But it was around the 2014, 2013, I actually just started becoming an agent. I was doing mostly book publicity and a little bit of ghostwriting and editorial support. And my business partner, Matt Latimer, and I, we sort of built up a network of people who wanted to do books. And we said, okay, we can try to do this. We know some editors like Priscilla. And there was a gentleman who had been in Washington where we live. And he had been involved in China policy going back to Kissinger. And his name was Michael Pillsbury. And he worked in 5 or 6 different administrations, sort of mid and increasingly senior level. And I had read an op-ed by his in the Wall Street Journal about China. And I said, I sat down with him. I'd known him through a couple people. I'd come out of politics, had worked in the Defense Department, and he was a sort of a longtime China hand at DOD, laboring away in the bowels of that building. And I said, there's something interesting here that you're saying about China that I'm not hearing. And this was, to take you back, there was sort of a bipartisan consensus that China was going to be a long-term partner. The more we traded with them, the more we invested, China would become increasingly a lean towards a democracy and become an ally of the United States. And his view of that was totally different. In fact, he had been a big champion of Nixon's opening to China and been a big supporter of this policy. But as he worked on it for 30 years, he said, we have this wrong. We don't actually understand how the Chinese view the world and sort of the hierarchical nature of superpowers and what Xi Jinping, who had just become premier at the time, what he really wants to do. And we turned that into a book that ended up, was called The 100-Year Marathon. And I think it is, to this day, or at least over the last 10, 12 years, the best-selling book on China, outpacing even Kissinger's book. And I think what made that book unique and surprising was that he was early and he had a counterintuitive, heterodox take. And I think when you're sort of the first to the party to say something that other people aren't, that is a huge boost to sales. And that book still sells every week, 200, 300 copies 12 years later, which may not sound like a lot, but for a book on ostensibly policy, America-China policy, it's sold. And the other thing I'd say about it is that what made it work in a way that a lot of Washington books don't is that there was a memoir component. It told the story of his philosophical awakening and his visit. He speaks and Mandarin fluently and had all these trips to China, and so that was an element too. And I think people relate to a personal story in a way that they can't a think tank white paper. So I think whenever you can, as an agent, I try to encourage our authors to put themselves in the story. And I think books are a great way to do that, and far different than really any other form of communication, a TV interview, a podcast, or an op-ed, to pull people in and tell them where you've been and your evolution.
Well, that's a great example. Matthew, can you describe a moment where you read a book and you just thought to yourself, if I don't make this into a movie or a TV series, I'm going to kill myself. It has to come out. It has to become a movie.
Well, I've certainly read books where I said I wouldn't be a very good agent if I couldn't place them. And I remember when I first read Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. And I was in a hotel room, like reading it in the bathtub while my wife and children were like sleeping in the main part of the room. And my the first thing I did was I went on Wikipedia to see if the story that he had told was well known. And I looked at the Wikipedia entry, and there certainly was one for the Osage murders of 1920. And I could have read that entry 100 times and never thought there was a movie or a particular dramatic story to it. And I think like David Grann's genius is that he found the narrative in that and the individual stories. And the qualities of that book were that it was like an incredible crime that was occurring, and that the chances of this crime sort of being found out and the perpetrators being brought to justice was extremely unlikely. So you have these large stakes, and you have you have a strong underdog quality to it. And then of course there's like a curiosity factor, because even though that story was on the cover of Time magazine in 1920, it felt like it had been like almost completely forgotten in our own time. So there was just the element of discovery that was startling, and all those qualities combined sort of made it clear that there was, a film in that.
I'm going to answer the question by saying that sometimes titles matter. I bought a book a few years ago by a very, very respected journalist who wanted to write the story of how a group of librarians in Timbuktu had saved the oldest Islamic manuscripts in the world, which are housed in the library there, from an attack from Al-Qaeda. And the story read like an Indiana Jones movie. But I'm not sure it would have found its audience had my colleague not come up to me after reading it and said, wow, those are some badass librarians in Timbuktu. And I thought, that's the title. And it became a bestseller. On the nonfiction side of things, what do you see that is new and different on today's lists, and that would be true as well of what makes it in nonfiction, either movie or television. What do you see, Keith?
I think if you look at the bestseller lists, it's as an agent, I don't know if you feel this way as an editor, it's increasingly difficult to predict what's going to work and what's not, at least in the 12, 13 years I've been doing this. I think what's working right now is nostalgia in a way. And I remember Matthew and I having a lunch in Hollywood maybe 3 years ago, and Matthew kind of put me onto that. We were talking about Air at the time, which was a big hit, and sort of this going back to the 80s. And I think, there's always an element of books, even in nonfiction, you'd expect this in fiction, but people want to escape, and I think books that take us to a different time where things feel a little less fraught, a little less crazy, the headlines are a little less unremitting. I think people want to go back. So, I think you see, a lot in sort of self-help and in improvement right now. That's sort of perennial successful. I think you see a lot in spirituality. That seems to be coming back in a big way, and I'm trying to represent some more authors in that space because, we do a lot of books that are tied to current events, and those are fun, they're exciting, they burn hot for a week or two, you get tons of interviews, and then they tend to fall off a cliff.
Right.
And so I think the challenge for us is with a lot of Washington and political books is finding things that have a tail. And so we've been dabbling a lot in pop culture. We did a book last year on the Aaron Sorkin show, The West Wing, which has sold 150,000 copies and is still selling. And I think that's because people, they don't want, if they want the news, they can read the newspaper. They don't need to read 80,000, 100,000 words of what's going on in Washington right now.
Right. Yeah, I think there's a withdrawal from Washington, but also from nonfiction in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that also a lot of these big idea books, sort of the Malcolm Gladwell stuff, Susan Cain, are kind of disguised self-help. Mm-hmm. And I think, the whole self-help and wellness, no wonder post-COVID, but also, in the middle of, all the political stuff that's going on in the world, people just don't want to read that.
Right.
They want to escape from it.
Right. Matthew, are you seeing anything that's new, or are you sort of comforted by the fact that certain books that are going to be great on the screen continue to show up?
Well, fortunately, they do continue to show up. There's sort of two types of nonfiction that I'm likely to be on the receiving end of. I'm much less likely to get sort of a Malcolm Gladwell kind of book, but I'll either get a book that we refer to as narrative nonfiction, which is kind of like maybe The Perfect Storm, something that tells a discrete story. Killers of the Flower Moon is an example of that too, or Big Short, or what have you. And those are pretty clear in terms of like how they might be adapted. And even Feud, Capote versus the Swans, which was Capote's Women, it wasn't telling Capote's entire life. It was just telling that story. Because in film and even in a television series, you really have a limited amount of space compared to what you have between hardcovers. But a lot of the stuff that gets submitted to me are sort of your cradle-to-grave biographies, which seem to continue to be popular. And those are a particular challenge for adaptation because of the space. And even though there have been lots of movies made historically that might cover a particular person's entire life, these days you have to sort of tease out what that episode is, what that theme is, or just try to pick a few episodes, as was done with Walter's book on Steve Jobs, to try to tell the whole story without telling the whole story, and that's the challenge.
Wow. Yeah, I can see that. That's tough. I would agree also with what Keith and Binky has said, which is there's a way of sometimes looking at the bestseller list and saying it's all about pain, recovering from pain, feeling pain, the memoirs that are selling are memoirs like I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. Or even if you look at Matthew McConaughey, the reason that worked, I think, so well is because it was about his pain, and his voice was so raw in describing it. And I think that's true of, Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation. It's about a lot of parents in pain. And a book that, man, I wished I'd published, The Body Keeps the Score. It's on the self-help list. It's been there for what? My lifetime. And it's again, another example of what I think Keith and Binky were talking about, which is we're in a moment where people are needing to be healed, and books, I think, are doing that to some extent. This is more for Keith. The conventional wisdom is that the left-leaning books sell when conservatives are in power, and right-leaning books sell when liberals are in power. Is that still true?
Well, we're 2 months in, 2.5 months in, so TBD, but I think that rule has been the case in my experience, that, when you have, people outside of power, they want to figure out how to get it. And so authors, like in the first Trump term, Timothy Snyder was sort of the best example of someone who was offering a history and context to explain the moment. And so I think there's always more energy and organization and a sense of, we've got to really fix this problem, because the other side doesn't see it as a problem. They think things are fine or great even. And so it's absolutely the case that when you have a Democratic president, the sales of conservative books go up, and vice versa. I think right now the question is, what is going to work? And I don't think there's a good answer yet. I've had a couple books. I had a book that came out last week by a reporter named Alex Eisenstadt on sort of the Trump campaign. And that guy, we had scoop after scoop after scoop for literally 3 months before the book came out. And it sold okay. It just barely missed the bestseller list. But that didn't move the needle. And I think there's still, that was sort of in the middle. It wasn't necessarily appealing to, sort of a resistance, anti-Trump crowd. It was just sort of, hey, here's what happened. And I think we don't know what this term is going to bring in terms of political books. I think the jury's very much still out.
And I guess I wanted to ask all of you, the same thing that I think is upending our political moment in terms of what to do, how to react, where to go, I think is also in some ways hurting books, because it's helping in some ways, but our competition isn't another book or maybe even a show on television that night. It's the fact that something in the news is so big that it keeps you from being able to focus on maybe buying a book. I don't know if you've noticed that, Binky,
Well, I think, shorter books are selling a lot better than longer books.
Right.
And I think people are just so distracted, but maybe more now than they were a couple months ago, but I think they're always distracted now. Social media has just completely disrupted everything. Why not reading? I think it has disrupted reading.
Yeah.
On the other hand, there's so many more platforms that people emerge from as authors. So you've got John Green and tuberculosis from his podcast and his YouTube thing. You've got, there's a million examples of people that have come up through. So that's kind of interesting. But then why are people not, listening to those podcasts, watching YouTube, instead of reading a book? I think our competition has grown, and I think your competition is not helping us, too.
Speak to that, Matthew.
Well, I would say, even in film entertainment, the sort of incumbent formats, like a 2.5-hour movie or even an hour television series, is suffering from competition with YouTube. People spend more time watching YouTube than any other form of television. It's something like 30 or 40% more than Netflix, which would be the second most successful platform. And I certainly see that in my own children. There's something that, about the immediacy of it or the type of storytelling that you get, but the fact that it's shorter is also, you know, a big boon. They can watch it on the bus, and they can watch it when their friends come over. There's definitely, you know, together with a friend, even if they don't have time to see like a full thing. So this idea of something that's shorter is definitely infringing on everything that is longer.
What has been, can you each talk about, or if you have an example of an experience where something came out of nowhere to help sell your book, that you just thought, what? That podcast? I never heard of it.
I did a book about 1.5 years ago, and I think there was sort of this conventional wisdom at the time, which is that history is really struggling. You can't do, you know, Priscilla has quarterbacked more history books than really any editor I know, and and represents, you know, great authors and edited like David McCullough and you know, Walter Isaacson, and those books, you know, I think have become harder and harder. And so we did a book called The Mysterious Disappearance of Rudolph Diesel,
Oh, yeah.
which was an Atria, a book, and it was about this sort of story, a little bit like Matt's from turn of the century, that people didn't know about, this quirky inventor named Rudolph Diesel who invented the diesel engine, but people had forgotten about him. It turned out he disappeared in sort of on the eve of World War I, on what they thought was a suicide off the coast of the Netherlands on a ship bound for London. And you know, normally I would be surprised if a book like that worked. I think what made that book work was that there was a mystery and a true crime component. Did he actually kill himself? If so, why would he? He was one of the most successful inventors at the time. And you know, so the author, what made that book work was he's actually Megyn Kelly's husband, a guy named Douglas Brunt, who was a novelist. This was his first nonfiction book. And he tapped into not only Megyn's podcast, but this growing number of sort of alternative media, not Joe Rogan, but they're, you know, for hundreds of podcasts that are sort of in that world, Sean Ryan. And, you know, he went on, he told the story, he was a good storyteller, he had done new research in the archives. And I think sort of the traditional model of, you know, maybe 15, 20 years ago, which is go on the Today Show and do, you know, a few, you know, CNN hits to get your story out. That works less and less for authors, sort of the traditional earned media rollout. And so you've got to be scrappier, and you've got to be willing to spend, you know, a few hours every day doing podcasts that maybe you never heard of, but actually have a very loyal audience, and that if a host gets behind it and says, you really got to read this book, that will do far more than going on Anderson Cooper or, you know, name your cable news show.
Binky, that's your experience.
I completely agree. I don't know, the publisher of this book, 5 Ways to Wealth, do you know what this book is?
Yes, Valentine book, yeah.
And is a businessman with no known platform. And it's 5 Ways to Wealth, not just riches, but, you know, health, wealth, psychological wealth. I don't know, I haven't read the book, but this guy just went out and did podcasts, small, medium, and large, and sold 60,000 copies in 2 weeks. So that's really a new thing. I think a completely new thing. Book reviews don't seem to sell. No. Ads certainly don't, blurbs don't. Word of mouth sells. Podcast is a form of word of mouth.
What was the book recently where a football player for a major NFL team was reading it on the sidelines?
Oh, yeah.
And he had it open in between plays. It was #1 on Amazon the next day. I forget who do you remember who it was, Matt?
I don't. It was some sort of a self-help, though, or management consulting, or
Leadership. Yeah, that's yeah. But also even with even with our friend Walter Isaacson, I mean, he had all of the conventional media for the Elon Musk book, but I remember it wasn't until he went on Lex Friedman that the book just took off, and that combined with these subreddit groups of Elon Musk sort of EV vehicle fans is what did it. Not CBS Sunday Morning so much, or any of the other conventional ways of selling a book.
Well, I think they're less, this is a good thing, probably, that they're less gatekeepers to tastemakers, you know? I mean, we're a long way from Walter Cronkite and the CBS Evening News, and we're in an era now where there's sort of, you know, Matthew's talking about YouTube, it's sort of, the curation is either algorithmic or it's, you know, small people who maybe they lack in total reach, they make up for in enthusiasm. And so there's something a little bit, you know, it's harder to predict what can be a bestseller, for sure, but I think there's something a little bit more organic about it. And once sort of the, you know, I think one of the things that I've seen is like there's no substitute for a great book and organic word of mouth. If someone reads a book and says, gosh, this is really, you know, I have to read this because it changes the way I think about parenting, or, you know, name your subject, they tell other people. And those are the books that sell over a long period of time. So, yeah.
And you have the experience, Matthew, of the shows on television, Jenna Pick, those that continue to be very effective in.
Well, to go back to the previous question, the movie business equivalent to like the surprise change in circumstances is really actually a viral success of a book. So you might make a normal kind of film deal for a book like Where the Crawdads Sing, you know, before the book's publication, because we're frequently in a selling mode prior to publication, and then be delightfully surprised when the book performs so well. And in that case, it really was the, you know, extraordinary performance of the book as a book, which really added a tremendous degree of momentum to the development of the film, and to ultimately there being a film, and not just a film, but a film that was very faithful to the book. Yeah. So all those sorts of factors are very influential to how books get adapted. And to your point, I read recently, I don't remember where, that like selling is the transfer of enthusiasm from one person to another. So, which seems obvious, of course, but when you read a review, sometimes it comes off as dry, even if it is appreciative of the book. And some of these influencers on YouTube or wherever you might find them, they're speaking with a great deal of passion and enthusiasm, and that is infectious. And that's why maybe those things go a little further.
And what do we think of book talk?
Book talk is a great example. You know, people get fired up when they see enthusiastic, you know, readers on book talk, especially in a literally animated fashion. They're, you know, they're seeing all their mannerisms and whatnot. It's very effective.
Well, Priscilla said at the beginning there's something about romanticism. I said, well, don't ask us about that, because none of us know anything about romanticism. But the fact of the matter is there's so many marketing levers right now that are, women in this country buy books and always have. So, you know, when you look at, you've got Reese Witherspoon, you've got Jenna Bush, you've got Oprah, you've got all these women's book clubs out there pounding away. And what do they love? They love commercial women's fiction. So there's a disproportionate amount of that. This kind of gets into romance, romantasy, Colleen Hoover, these, you know, we've never seen numbers like this for what is fiction that is not probably going to be here even 5 years from now, never mind 20. And that's your enthusiasm.
So what is going to last? We one of the most successful editors in our publishing announced she was retiring this week. She's a colleague and old friend of Binky's, and somebody said about her, she built books that last. So on fiction in particular, Binky, how do you build a book that lasts? What are the books that last?
It's just the book. The book just has to have it. So one of my favorite stories about this is Jenny Egan's book, Goon Squad, which Knopf published in the fall. They insisted on presenting this book as a bunch of interconnected short stories. I kept saying, novel would be a better way to sell it. They weren't listening to me. And this thing dropped like a stone in the pond, sunk right to the bottom. around January, the woman who was then running Vintage Books, which is the paperback arm of Knopf, called me and said, let's have lunch. We went out. She said, I love Goon Squad, and Knopf is completely screwed up. I want you to give me the paperback rights now. Usually it's a year after hardcover publication that a book goes into the cheaper edition. And I know how to market this book. And I went home from lunch, I called Jenny, I said, I don't see what we have to lose because we don't have nothing's happening here. So we gave them the paperback rights, and she published that book in the early winter. And, you know, you can't keep a good book down. By that time, you know, the word of mouth on that book was just spreading no matter what you did. People were loving it and embracing it. And then it won the Pulitzer Prize. Hello. So, you know, it was just a great moment of a great book that you can't keep it down. It might sink for a while. It might not be an immediate find. It might not be an immediate bestseller. And then there's tons of books that are just really great books, generally memoirs, if you ask me. Because I think what Keith is saying before, I say once a week, don't tell me the story of the Holocaust, tell me the story of Anne Frank. You know, if you can tell a story through people relate to people. They don't, much more than events, I think, you know. And there are memoirs like Barbarian Days by Bill Finnegan, which is the memoir about surfing. That book, you know, it's just one of those magical books that just sells and sells and sells year in and year out. It's a great book.
Now, speaking of memoirs, are there too many of them?
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that as a challenge?
I think
all of you.
I think that's probably all of our faults for
Yeah.
not being better gatekeepers on this sort of thing, because a lot of these stories, you know, aren't books. Maybe they're articles, or maybe they're essays, someplace, or maybe they're just diary entries that somebody should write and shove in the drawer. I mean, I just, honestly, and I mean, I don't know how many are, and I think that, you know, the need to bring more diverse voices into the marketplace, too, means that we've just got, you know, some amazing diverse stories, memoirs, but just way too many were published, and I think that has just kind of buried the market. Memoir will come back. I mean, these genres always come back. I mean, nobody's reading short stories right now because there's too much short stuff available online. But, you know, then you get George Saunders, and guess what? You've got a great selling short story collection again.
Yeah, Binky reminds me of a saying that I heard very early from an editor, which is that most books should be magazine articles, and most magazine articles shouldn't have been written. So I think, you know, the reality with, you know, and we get a call at least once a week from someone in Washington, Democrat, Republican, member of Congress, member of the Senate, someone inside the administration, saying, I've got this great story, I've got a memoir, I want to tell my whole life, and 90% of the time it doesn't work, because you've got to have, you know, to have a reader spend 30 of their hard-earned dollars on a book, it's got to be something new and enlightening and illuminating, and, you know, as Binky was saying, it's got to sing, it has to have an authenticity on the page that sounds like the person. And, you know, from the world that I am, where I do represent a lot of journalists and political figures and people kind of coming out of politics, they're used to having their stuff ghostwritten, and they, you know, it's schlock at the end of the day. And it doesn't work in book form. And so you've got, I think, political memoir especially has gotten a bad name over the last decade, because, you know, they're people who are thinking they can just bank on platform, which is the thing that you hear over and over and over from editors about what they're looking for. Does this person have 2 million followers on X or Instagram? And if they have that, that's the substitute for everything. Well, it's actually not. You know, you still can't, you can have all the followers in the world, but unless you have a book that people are going to recommend to other people, it's not going to sell. I do think, you know, I was sort of surprised, we were talking earlier about what's working on the bestseller list. You know, I think one thing that always helps sell a book is sort of the Streisand effect, and I think it's number 2 or number 3 on the nonfiction list. This book on Facebook, which you know, there have been probably 100 books in the last 5 years on social media and inside Meta and Facebook or Instagram, and they don't sell. But this one worked because it was by a fairly junior executive who had some access to Sheryl Sandberg and Mark Zuckerberg and wrote a tell-all about it. And it was not doing well. I was tracking it when it came out, the week that it came out. And then on the Thursday or Friday after launch, Facebook said, we're going to sue. This book should never have been written.
We're going to shut this down.
We're going to shut it down. And it went to #1 immediately.
It really drove us crazy as competitors. Like, could you do it to all our books? You know, this would really help. Yeah, yeah.
But that was a great story, because Deb Futter, who published that book, I ran into the other night, and the Macmillan sales force actually sold, they printed, their first printing was 200,000 copies. That meant they had great bookstore orders for that book. And they sold it on nothing. They just said, trust us, this book is going to be a bestseller. They couldn't talk about it in the book advance, because Facebook would have just shut them. They would have gotten a restraining order, and probably that would have been the end of the book. So they got the book out. Even Amazon, which is notoriously bad about taking a lot of books, took a lot of books, just on faith. I mean, it's an amazing publishing story how they did that, actually. And then the book delivers. It's very fun and very funny, and it's terrible about the people that most people have come to hate. So,
Yeah.
you know, there it is.
Matthew, does memoir translate easily to
Well,
your-
documentaries. Talk about documentaries.
Yeah.
They're so popular right now.
They are popular, but I work less in documentary.
Oh, sorry.
And memoirs are a challenge unless they're funny. There's always a tremendous appetite for source material for comedies because people don't write them that much. So when you are going to find them, it's frequently in memoir. But you know, movies and television series, they frequently need a larger than life component to them. Some element of spectacle, some sort of titanic conflict that, you know, between two maybe roughly equal parties that get resolved towards the end. And those are things that you're not always going to find in memoirs.
I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but there got to be a point in when the memoirs were coming at us so fast and furious that I wanted to have a rule that unless you're 45, you can't write a memoir because you haven't figured out anything. And sure enough, when you inherit a memoir that's been bought and you realize that a lot of what's happening in the pages is the author figuring themselves out. And you kind of want to wait for when they've actually succeeded in doing that. So anyway.
And also the fact that so many people start a memoir at the beginning of their lives. Some very smart editor said to me at one point, isn't it amazing how uninteresting people are? You know, the younger you go back, the less interesting they are. And it's really true. But.
So recently, somebody on nonfiction, somebody wrote a piece, I think actually it was in The Atlantic, about the fact that the white male writer is now absent from bestseller lists. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but I'd like to hear you guys rebut it if that's the case.
I think you can't conflate wokeness with who's buying books in this country, which, as I said before, are women.
Yeah.
And the fact that a lot of the marketing levers right now are just driving.
So it's who's buying versus.
Are just running toward women's taste. There is a bookstore in Santa Monica where the books are not arranged by author or by title, but by mood.
So did you notice what section was most popular?
I'm in the mood to feel sad, I'm in the mood to feel happy, I'm in the mood to fall in love, I'm in the mood to hate men. I don't know, I mean, I have no idea, but it's apparently a beautiful store and it's really doing well, so there. That's women, that's women buyers of women books only in that store.
So one of the things that I'm wondering about, and this is a question for Keith, I think, which is, do you think that the polarization that we're seeing in our politics is also translating into how people consume books? And I include in that sort of, you know, biographies of leaders that at the time that they were leaders were at least respected from both sides.
I think absolutely, and I think, sort of the tribalism and, sort of the atomization of American politics, which is real, and it's fed by social media, it's fed by traditional media, and sort of everyone sort of hearing what they want, buying and making choices based on what they already believe to be true. I think rare are the successful books, at least in sort of the current events, politics, space that really challenges their audience or perceived audience to think differently. I think a lot of book buying habits is based on sort of belonging and group identity, and so the authors that sort of tap into that, and it's not a bad thing. It's a function of where America is in 2025, that people want to buy things that speak to what they believe, and I think a lot of books are sort of totems for their belief system, and they buy a book because they want to display it on their bookshelf or have on their coffee table to say who they are. And I think for political books, that means that you're just sort of speaking to your own little audience, and you got to get them motivated and ginned up. And so, if you're a conservative, you're doing that via, Fox News primetime. If you're a liberal, you're doing that by going on the Rachel Maddow show. And those are the things that, drive books, drive book sales. So I think that polarization is very real, and I don't see it going away.
Have you noticed it as well in what you are, and how you're selling, or in the appetite of folks either consuming TV or?
Well, if you talk about the mood of audiences for film and entertainment right now, I think the mood is take a little vacation from your problems.
Yeah.
And maybe escape a little bit. Hollywood, which has done some political programming, but even if you go back to that Seth Rogen movie, which prompted the North Korean hack of Columbia Pictures, political works have a tendency to create headaches in all sorts of ways. And the last few movies didn't perform so well either. So if you're not making a lot of money and you're creating a lot of headaches, and it doesn't feel like what the audience wants, is some strong disincentives to pursue that programming. And that's the current mood.
Yeah.
I've got to tell a little story about that, because Matthew and I worked on this project together, and it was an example of a memoir. I think it was the only Trump administration memoir that got turned into ended up being a TV show. But I had represented FBI Director James Comey on his book Higher
Right.
Loyalty,
I
which
remember that.
was a smash book success and sold over 1 million copies. And Matthew said, this is an interesting project, let's take it on. We did meetings with all the top studios, CBS and Showtime ended up buying it. And the number of times that thing almost died because of the exact sort of dynamics that Matthew's talking about. Ooh, like this is a little too hot to handle. I don't know if our audience is going to like this. And it's really because of Matthew's skill and determination. Another guy, Shane Salerno, who was involved in the project, just got it done by dint of perseverance and will.
Right. Every time the green light decision went up a rung of the hierarchy at Viacom, there was like a new hesitation. And that was the one rare case where every hesitation was overcome, which was sort of miraculous. And then the movie really performed, and that did get an audience, which was a happy occasion. But yes, that was
Rare.
the exception that proved the rule.
Well, we have a minute left, so I'm going to each ask you one question, which is, what project are you working on that you're most excited about right now? Matthew.
Well, it's not a project I'm working on. Hopefully my work is done. I'm most excited about The Friend, which is Sigrid Nunez's National Book Award winning novel, which was adapted into a film. It's being released in New York and Los Angeles today, in fact, and it will go wide to the rest of the country a week from today. I won't describe it because we have only a minute left, but it's a marvelous movie, and I recommend it to you.
Thank you. Binky, I think I know what your answer is.
You do?
Yeah,
Tell me.
the Michael Pollan?
Oh, God, yes, the Michael Pollan. Michael Pollan's new book is about, is In Search of Consciousness, what it is versus what we might think it is. And it is spectacular. And it will be out maybe, oh, God, I don't even know, in the fall, I think. Really good.
I'm working on a book with a pastor named Cliff Connectal, who is an incredible evangelist. He goes to campuses like this and speaks and engages skeptics and non-believers, and is just this unbelievable communicator. So he's writing a book about the Gospels with Zondervan that I'm really excited
Ooh.
about. So
Have you sold it yet?
we did. We
Oh,
did.
shit.
We did.
And I'm looking forward to a book by Robert Wright, who is an evolutionary psychologist and wrote a terrific bestseller called Why Buddhism is True. His new book is called The God Test, and it's about why AI is the biggest challenge in our evolutionary history to humanity itself. And it's sort of a way up there in the clouds look at AI. So.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.